One quiet morning on the Wyoming frontier, a solitary woman discovered a fragile orphan Mustang Foal on her doorstep. As she nursed it back to life, a deeper mystery unfolded. Where was the foal's mother? And why had this wild creature come to her? What began as an act of compassion turned into a quiet rebellion against the rules of nature. But in a world that often asks us to look away, could one woman's choice to care rewrite the story of survival for a mare and herself? Before we dive into the full story, let us know in the comments where you're watching or listening from. Horses have incredible stories. What's yours? Share in the comments so others can be inspired. Like and don't forget to hit subscribe. Your support motivates us to share more impactful stories. The soil was soft beneath Silvia's gardening gloves as she leaned into her small patch of earth, coaxing kale stems free from the ground. The morning sun filtered through the pine trees, laying golden ribbons over her shoulders. A trowel rested nearby, unused for the moment. She preferred the feel of earth under her nails. The air in this part of Wyoming smelled like sagebrush, a memory. It had been only 6 weeks since Silvia moved into the little timber frame house nestled near the edge of the Bureau of Land Management, BLM, lands. Out here, with no neighbors in view, just the rustle of aspen leaves. One quiet morning on the Wyoming frontier, a solitary woman discovered a fragile orphan Mustang Foal on her doorstep. As she nursed it back to life, a deeper mystery unfolded. Where was the foal's mother? And why had this wild creature come to her? What began as an act of compassion turned into a quiet rebellion against the rules of nature. But in a world that often asks us to look away, could one woman's choice to care rewrite the story of survival for a mare and herself? Before we dive into the full story, let us know in the comments where you're watching or listening from. Horses have incredible stories. What's yours? Share it in the comments so others can be inspired. Like and don't forget to hit subscribe. Your support motivates us to share more impactful stories. Paying her company, she had discovered something she hadn't realized she needed. A place where time felt slower and breath came easier. Her hair, once the color of molasses, now silvered and tied in a loose braid, brushed the collar of her faded flannel shirt as she straightened. Her jeans were patched at the knee. Her boots were scuffed and dusty from the trail that cut between her back porch and the edge of the meadow. She wiped sweat from her brow and looked out toward the low hills. And there they were again, for Mustangs, maybe 5 today, with manes tangled by the wind, picking carefully through the edges of her fence line. They were drawn to the scattered scraps of lettuce, beet greens, and bruised carrots she tossed beyond the garden after each harvest. She never meant to feed them. Not really, but they came anyway, silent, watchful, magnificent. One of them, a roan with a blaze down its nose, lifted its head and looked directly at her. Not startled, just aware. Silvia held her breath. The connection didn't last more than a few seconds. But in that moment, something ancient stirred in her chest. Something she had almost forgotten, the awe she felt as a child. The first time she touched a horse's muzzle. The smell of sun-warmed hide and hay, the rhythmic sway of riding bareback with her cousin through open fields. "Lord," she whispered, almost without meaning to, sure know how to stitch the silence with wonder. She sat back on the upturned bucket beside her tool shed, watching until the horses moved on. Her boots tapped lightly against the dry earth. She didn't cry, but her chest ached as if too full of something tender to contain. This was what she had come here for. Not escape, not grief, just room to breathe after her daughter, Lily, got married and moved to Vermont. Silvia hadn't fallen apart. She'd packed. She'd sold the big house in Boise and traded it for a smaller life on the edge of wilderness. The ache of letting go was softened by purpose. She wanted to feel connected again to the land, to her own breath, to something that didn't depend on Wi-Fi signals or holiday visits. Her home was simple. 2 bedrooms, a wood stove that snapped and crackled every night like it had stories of its own to tell, a porch with 2 mismatched chairs, one for sitting, the other mostly for watching the deer pass by in the dusk. Inside, photos of Lily lined the bookshelf. One in particular, a laughing shot of them both at a rodeo 10 years back, reminded Sylvia of a time when horses were more than background silhouettes. There was a time she almost bought a Mustang herself. Years ago, when Lily was still in middle school, they had visited a wild horse adoption event. Sylvia remembered standing at the corral fence, staring into the eyes of a young bay gelding, half-tame, skittish, but willing. They hadn't brought him home. Practicality won that day, but the dream never quite faded. "I wonder if he's still out there," she murmured, smiling a little. As she got to her feet, she dusted off her jeans and gathered the leftover carrot tops. The sun was higher now. Tom had tossed the scraps. She walked to the edge of her fence and scattered the greens gently, almost ceremonially. Birds chirped nearby, and a chipmunk darted through the tall grass. She lingered a moment longer, scanning the horizon for a flicker of mane or tail. The glint of sunlight on a broad, equine back. Nothing. But she knew they'd return. They always did. She closed the garden gate and returned to her tool shed. A hawk circled high above, and somewhere in the distance, the wind whispered across the dry hills like a secret. Sylvia smiled. Not the wide public smile she gave cashiers or old church friends, but the small, honest smile of a woman who knew she had made the right choice. Here on the edge of wild, she felt closer to herself than she had in decades. And that, to her, was more than enough, at least for now. The first sound was not much more than a whimper, barely louder than the breeze that slipped through the pine slats of Sylvia's porch railing. She was in the kitchen, rinsing her hands after planting early squash, humming a tune she didn't quite recognize, something Lily used to sing as a child. The melody caught in her throat when she heard it again. A faint, high-pitched squeal. Not a bird. Not quite. She stood still, water dripping from her fingertips, eyes narrowing toward the screen door. There was again. Sylvia stepped outside. The wood was cool beneath her bare soles. The late afternoon sun had softened to amber, stretching long shadows across her gravel drive. A few lazy flies hovered near the compost bin, but just beyond the far end of the fence, beside the large rock where she sometimes left kitchen scraps for curious animals, something moved. Her heart knocked once in her chest. It was small, uneven on its feet, shimmering in the golden light, like it didn't quite belong to this world. A foal, no bigger than a large dog, legs like reeds, coat dusty and rough, ribs clearly visible under stretched skin. It took a wobbling step toward the gate, then stopped as if the effort had cost too much. Sylvia approached slowly, instinct guiding her steps more than thought. Her voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper. "Easy now. Hey there, sweetheart." The foal flinched but didn't flee. Its eyes were too tired for flight. There was something desperate in the way it stood stiff but swaying, as though still expecting its mother to appear from the trees. But the space behind it was silent, and the young creature was utterly alone. Sylvia didn't dare reach out. Instead, she crouched down near the fence and simply sat with it, letting the silence hold them both. Minutes passed, maybe more. Then she stood, moved carefully to the tool shed, and returned with an old quilt, a shallow metal pan, and the last of the goat milk she had bought for soap making. It wasn't meant for feeding, but it would do. The foal watched as she poured the milk and nudged the pan toward it. It sniffed once, uncertain, then again, then slowly, timidly, it drank. Only then did Sylvia allow herself to exhale. "Well," she murmured half to herself, "guess you picked the right porch." She spent the next hour preparing a space in the shed, clearing out crates, laying straw, hanging a lantern. She filled a bucket with water, soaked some alfalfa pellets, and tore up an old flannel shirt to use as rags. The foal followed her with halting steps, its head drooping, tail limp. Inside the shed, Sylvia wrapped it loosely in the quilt and sat down on a nearby stool. "I suppose someone should name you," she said softly. "Can't just keep calling you baby." The foal blinked slowly, as if already fading into sleep. "You look like you've been through hell," she added, running a hand gently down its narrow neck. "But you're here, and that counts." There was a time years ago when she had dreamed of having a horse. Not just a trail ride here or there, but her own. Life, as it often does, had intervened, marriage, mortgage, motherhood. Priorities realigned, but the dream never fully dissolved. And now, somehow, here it was again, delivered on trembling legs without warning. Silvia leaned back against the wall of the shed, knees pulled to her chest. It was a strange kind of ache. Joy tangled with worry, purpose twined with helplessness. She didn't know where the foal came from. She didn't know if it would survive the night. But for now, in this quiet corner of Wyoming, beneath a ceiling of timber and dusk, she was not alone. This story took us a lot of time. So, if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The foal stirred just after dawn, twitching softly in sleep. Silvia had barely slept herself. She'd spent most of the night on a stool just inside the shed door, wrapped in a heavy wool blanket, one eye always on the small shape nestled in straw and flannel. She didn't know its name yet. Somehow naming it felt like making a promise she wasn't sure she could keep. The rising sun brushed its rays across the shed floor. The light crept slowly forward, gold and pale. It was going to be a dry day, the kind that baked the earth to cracking if you weren't careful with water. Silvia rose and stretched her back, stiff from the awkward sleep, her mind already grinding with questions she hadn't yet dared say aloud. 10 days old. That's all this foal could be, maybe less. Its legs were unsteady. Its eyes had that newborn sheen. But had made it here alone or not alone. She stared out through the open shed door toward the tree line that bordered the far end of her property. A light wind stirred the grass beyond the fence, but there was no sound, no movement. She poured water into the shallow metal pan again and offered it to the foal, who slurped weakly, then blinked up at her with sleepy confusion. Silvia ran a hand gently down its neck. "Where's your mama?" she whispered. "Where'd you come from?" She cleaned the shed, tidied up the rags, and fed the foal again before standing in the doorway with her arms crossed. Her boots were already laced. She didn't need a map. She knew this land better than she had ever known a neighbor's name. But still, her mind traced the imaginary lines, which direction the foal had likely wandered from, how far a baby horse could travel, and where a mare might hide if she were sick, weak, or dying. She packed her old canvas bag with water bottles, a vet-style syringe from Lily's soap-making days, 2 apples, and a flashlight just in case. Then she left a shallow pan of milk next to the foal and set out on foot across the field. Grass crunched beneath her boots. The sun was warm now. A hawk called overhead, circling, then drifting higher into the blue. Silvia followed a dry creek bed that snaked between 2 ridges. The foal had come from this direction, she was certain. Hoof prints were scattered in the soft dirt. Light ones, small ones, and then bigger ones. Her breath caught in her throat. The trail grew fainter near a copse of willow and wild plum. They were half hidden beneath low branches. She saw a shape collapsed, motionless at first glance. Her heart thudded. She stepped closer, cautious but fast, weaving between low brush and burrs. And then she saw more clearly. Bay-coated, dust-covered. Her ribs stood out like the beams of an old shipwreck. Flies clustered near her eyes, and her breathing was shallow but steady. Silvia dropped to her knees. The mare blinked slowly but didn't move. One ear twitched toward Silvia, then fell still again. She was lying on her side, legs tucked awkwardly beneath her. Her body half curved into the weeds, as if she'd folded herself into the earth to disappear. Silvia reached out, touched the mare's neck, gently feeling for warmth, for life. "Hey, girl," she murmured, her voice low and careful. "You're here. I see you." She looked around. The spot was sheltered, just enough brush to hide her from view. There were a few grazed-down patches of grass nearby, and a trickle of old hoof prints, barely visible. The mare had been here for at least a day or 2, maybe longer, but somehow she'd survived. "You picked a smart spot," Silvia said quietly, her hand resting on the mare's shoulder. "You didn't give up." She pulled out her water bottle, twisted off the cap, and poured a little into her palm. The mare didn't respond. Silvia tried again, wetting her lips, then the fur just under her jaw. "Come on," she whispered. "You're not done yet." As she sat there, crouched beside the dying animal, a memory rose from the far corners of her mind, something she'd long forgotten. She was 16 at a summer horse camp, brushing the mane of a gray mare named Clementine. The horse had pulled away, scared of thunder. Silvia had followed her into the storm, coaxed her back with nothing more than a handful of clover and a prayer whispered under her breath. She remembered thinking, if I could calm a creature that big and scared, maybe I could survive too. Now, decades later, she felt the same current pass between them. I'm not leaving you out here, she said. The mare didn't move, but Silvia felt her heartbeat. It was there, fragile but present. She sat for a while longer, then stood slowly, brushing dust from her knees. The mare needed help. Real help. But first, she had to get back and figure out what she had, what she could bring, and what it would take to keep this creature alive through the night. You stay right here, Silvia said. Your little one's waiting. She turned, heart pounding, legs stiff, but her mind already ticking through the inventory of her shed and pantry. There was a life still clinging here. Two, in fact, and now they were her responsibility. The screen door creaked and slammed shut behind Silvia as she stepped inside the silence of the cabin, broken only by the ticking of the old clock on the mantel. Her boots tracked dust across the kitchen floor, but she didn't notice. Her mind was racing, mapping out items, repurposing what she had, calculating what might keep a nearly starved mare alive through the coming night. She moved quickly, focused. The calm of the morning had been replaced by the sharp clarity that came with purpose. Okay, think, she murmured aloud. Water, shelter, calories, protection from wind. She grabbed 2 empty gallon jugs and filled them at the sink. Then she rummaged through the bottom cabinet where she stored old towels and cut rags. She found 3 large feed sacks, leftovers from a neighbor who once gave her chicken pellets, and stuffed them in her canvas backpack along with a pair of scissors, duct tape, and a half-used jar of honey she'd been saving for baking. In the medicine cabinet, she found a bottle of iodine, a roll of gauze, and a syringe without a needle, meant for lotion making, but close enough to deliver fluids if she had to. A worn plastic tarp, folded and dusty, sat near the shed, originally meant for covering firewood. It would do for a windbreak. She rolled it tightly and tied it with twine. By the time she stepped back onto the porch, her pack was heavy, her hands full, and her breathing a little faster than usual. The foal, still unnamed, stood weakly in the shed doorway, blinking at her, its legs wobbly but holding. Silvia stopped, crouched, and reached out. I'm going to help your mama now, she said softly. You stay here. I'll be back soon. It didn't understand, of course, but it didn't need to. She hoped the warmth in her voice would do what words couldn't. She made her way back through the brush this time, faster, more direct. The sun had climbed higher, heating the rocks, pulling the scent of sage and dry pine into the air. By the time she reached the grove where the mare lay, Silvia's shirt clung to her back with sweat. The mare hadn't moved. Her breathing was still shallow, but when Silvia approached, her ears flicked slightly, but enough. You waited, Silvia said gently, kneeling beside her again. Good girl. She laid down the tarp first, spreading it wide behind the mare's back where the ground dipped. Then she propped one edge with branches, using the duct tape to hold 2 sticks in a crude X to anchor a corner just enough to shade and block the afternoon breeze. It wasn't elegant, but it was something. Silvia soaked a towel in water and wrung it gently over the mare's muzzle and neck. The mare flinched at first, then stilled. Silvia used the syringe to drop a bit of water into the mare's mouth, then a little more. Then again, small steps. I don't know if this is right, she admitted aloud, but I'd rather do too much than nothing at all. She mixed a slurry of soaked pellets and water in a small tin and tried to coax the mare. No luck yet, but the scent of food might do its work in time. She paused, leaning back on her heels, sweat dripping from her temples. Her knees ached, her fingers were scratched, but her eyes stayed focused, scanning for signs of response, improvement. Anything. A faint breeze lifted the edge of the tarp, fluttering like the wing of some watchful spirit. Silvia reached in her bag and pulled out the jar of honey. Using a bit of gauze, she spread a small amount across a patch of dry skin where a shallow wound had scabbed and cracked. This stuff healed my daughter's hand after she ran it through a blackberry thicket, she said, her voice quieter now. She was 9, didn't even cry. The mare exhaled long and soft. Silvia sat beside her and let her hand rest on the mare's shoulder. The quiet between them felt fragile, like the pause in a lullaby before the next note. Time passed slow and full. Silvia kept refreshing the cool rags, kept murmuring softly. As the sun dipped lower behind the ridge, painting the trees in amber, she knew she couldn't walk away. Not tonight. She pulled her blanket from the pack and spread it near the mare's flank. Then she lay down slowly, back pressed to the ground, staring up through the mesh of branches. The leaves rustled above like hushed voices. Somewhere beyond the bend, the foal waited in the shed. Somewhere time marched on. Silvia closed her eyes, not in surrender, but in quiet readiness. "I didn't come here looking to save anything," she whispered. "But maybe this is what I was meant to find." She stayed with the mare until the stars came out, a steady breath beside a struggling one. A nest made not of straw and sticks, but of will and empathy. Enjoying the story? A like helps others find it. A comment lets us know what you're thinking, and a share might bring someone a moment of peace. Subscribe if you want more tales like this. Now, let's return to the journey. The next morning came heavy with a sky the color of pewter and the wind smelling faintly of rain that hadn't yet arrived. Silvia stood at her kitchen table with a slice of toast. She couldn't bring herself to finish it, staring at the open notebook where she'd scribbled a short checklist. Water, tarp, vet contact, legal. The pen had long run out of ink. The foal had made it through another night. He was still weak, but standing longer, eating more. Silvia had started calling him Ash in her mind, though she hadn't said it out loud yet. It was something about the soft, gray bloom in his coat, and the way he'd risen from the edge of loss, like a coal still glowing under the ash. The mare, Raven now, because of the darkness in her coat and eyes, was alive, still lying down, but more aware, more present. That morning, Silvia refreshed the water buckets, checked the tarp shelter again, and left a few soaked alfalfa cubes within reach of Raven's muzzle. She whispered gently to both of them before climbing into her truck. It had been over a year since she'd made the drive into town. She didn't much like the feeling of pavement under her tires anymore. The quiet roads didn't comfort her the way the meadow grasses did, and traffic lights always seemed to blink too bright against her windshield. But this wasn't about comfort. The ranger station sat low and square, just off the main highway, with a faded BLM logo out front and a bulletin board nailed to the porch post that always had flyers about water restrictions or elk sightings. She pulled into the gravel lot, turned off the engine, and sat still for a moment. Her fingers gripped the steering wheel longer than necessary. It was always harder when you didn't know if someone would hear you. Inside, the building smelled like coffee and old carpet. A bell rang as the door swung, closed behind her. A man in a government green shirt looked up from behind the desk. He was in his early 50s, maybe, with salt and pepper stubble and kind enough eyes that still carried the guarded neutrality of someone used to hearing strange stories. "Morning," he said, setting his mug aside. "Can I help you?" "I hope so," Silvia replied. Her voice sounded quieter in here than she'd expected. "I've got a situation on my land. It's about a pair of Mustangs." His brow lifted slightly. "I found a foal, probably no more than 10 days old, on my property 2 mornings ago. He was weak but alone. I've been caring for him, and yesterday I found his dam not far from my fence line. She's collapsed alive but barely. I've tried to stabilize her, water, makeshift shelter, but she needs real help soon." He nodded slowly as she spoke, and when she finished, he let out a breath and folded his hands on the desk. "I appreciate you coming in, ma'am, but you probably know those horses are wild, federally protected. It's not legal to interfere with them in most cases." Silvia didn't flinch, but her voice dropped. "And letting her die right there with her baby beside her, that's legal?" He hesitated. "It's not about right or wrong. It's about precedent, policy. Interventions are only allowed if the horses are presenting danger to the herd or to people. A single sick mare out on open land falls under natural selection." Silvia felt something tighten behind her ribcage. She had imagined being turned away, but not so calmly. Not with this kind of gentle, practiced dismissal. "So you're saying let her die? That's the policy?" He sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying this is the wild. We let nature take its course. If we stepped in every time a foal got separated or a mare collapsed, we'd be managing hundreds of individual cases a month. It's not sustainable. That's why we don't intervene unless it's critical to the larger population. Silvia stared at him for a long moment. Her mouth had gone dry. Funny, she said. I thought we were supposed to protect them. He looked down at his desk. We protect their freedom, not their survival. She didn't speak again. She turned and walked out without saying thank you. Back in the truck, she sat in silence for a long while. The door half open, keys dangling from her fingers. A breeze moved through the cottonwoods behind the building, rattling dry leaves like slow applause. She watched them without blinking. At last, she closed the door gently, started the engine, and headed home. The drive back felt longer somehow. The sky had darkened, the smell of rain closer now. The foothills rolled toward her like waves of quiet challenge, and her knuckles whitened slightly on the steering wheel. She didn't cry. She didn't talk, but her mind moved in sharp circles. What did it mean to protect freedom if it meant letting something die when you could stop it? Who decided when doing nothing was noble and when it was cowardice? She pulled into her driveway and saw Ash in the shed doorway, head lifted as if he'd been waiting, as if he knew. Silvia got out, crossed the yard, and knelt beside him. He pushed his head into her shoulder. Don't worry, she whispered, voice thick. Now I've heard what he said, and I'm still not going to let her die. Ash nickered softly, a small sound, a thread of trust. She stood, turned toward the hills where Raven lay hidden in her tarp shelter, and breathed deep. The wind had shifted cooler now. Silvia knew she couldn't fix everything, but she could choose not to walk away. And sometimes that was enough. By late afternoon, the clouds had thickened like bruises across the sky, and the air had that particular stillness Wyoming knew how to conjure right before a storm. Silvia moved quickly, focused, methodical. Her fingers worked through muscle memory as she pulled ropes from a bin behind the tool shed and hauled out 2 wooden stakes she'd used once for stringing tomato plants. Her canvas bag now held a hatchet, baling wire, extra cloth, and a bottle of apple cider vinegar. She hoped it might keep flies at bay. She added a thick quilt from the closet, one she had sewn by hand the year Lily graduated high school. It was too worn for beds now, but not too worn for a life on the edge. By the time she reached the grove where Raven lay, Ash was tagging behind her, barely managing to keep up on his narrow, clumsy legs. Silvia stopped short, unsure whether to send him back or let him follow. The foal nosed her hip as if in silent insistence. All right, she murmured, eyes still on the trees. Maybe you need to see your mama stand up more than I do. The tarp shelter was still mostly intact, though one corner had collapsed slightly from where the wind had tugged it free. Raven hadn't moved much, but her eyes opened when Silvia approached. There was something different in them now. A flicker, not quite defiance, but no longer surrender either. You're stubborn, Silvia whispered as she knelt beside her. Which is good. I've always liked the stubborn ones. Ash wandered close, let out a soft whinny, and nuzzled his mother's side. The mare turned her head slowly, gently touching noses with him. Silvia's throat tightened. She laid the quilt over Raven's back like a soft hug and began reinforcing the shelter with more precision this time, anchoring the corners with rocks, knotting rope from low branches to the tarp's grommets. She dug a shallow trench around the perimeter with a flat edge of the hatchet, primitive, but just enough to divert water if rain came hard. Over the next hour, she cleaned Raven's legs with warm water, checked the wound near her flank again. Still no sign of infection, and used the vinegar-soaked cloth to dab gently around her eyes and ears. She didn't have fly repellent, but maybe this would help. Not exactly veterinary protocol, she muttered, but nobody told me I had to follow the manual. The clouds broke just before dusk. It didn't fall all at once, the storm, but in layers. First came the wind, slow and strong, sweeping through the trees like an exhale from something ancient. Then the light shifted. The sky turned copper, then charcoal. Finally, the rain, steady, deliberate drops that tapped the tarp like knuckles on an old door. Silvia huddled beneath the shelter with them. Ash pressed against her leg, shivering slightly. Raven stayed still, breathing slowly, her ears twitching with every gust. They sat like that for hours, not speaking, not sleeping, just enduring, just existing. 3 bodies under a flap of canvas held together by proximity in something less nameable. And in that closeness, something changed. It wasn't sudden, but gradual, like the warmth of a stove that eventually fills an entire room. Silvia found herself whispering again, not to soothe, not to instruct, but just to fill the space with presence. "When I was little," she said, voice low, "my granddad used to take me out to the edge of his property where the horses grazed. He had 2 old Mustangs, rescues. Said they weren't good for riding, but they were good for watching. He'd lean on the fence and just be still. I used to think it was the most boring thing in the world." She chuckled quietly, more breath than sound. "But now I think he was teaching me how to listen to quiet, to the shape of waiting." Ash curled closer beside her. Raven blinked slowly, her body still, but her ears angled towards Silvia's voice. "I used to think I'd be a horsewoman," she said after a while. "Had all these books, cut out pictures. Even entered a raffle at a county fair once for a saddle I couldn't afford. Then life. Well, life has other plans, doesn't it?" The rain eased a little. The wind softened. Silvia leaned back against the tree trunk and looked up at the folds of tarp above her. "I didn't think I came here to start over, but I think maybe I did." She didn't know how long they sat that way, only that the stars were out when the rain stopped and the air smelled clean in that way only night has after a storm. She adjusted the blanket over Raven one last time, pressed a hand to the mare's side, then touched Ash gently between the ears. "You're not mine," she said softly, "but for now I'm yours." And in the darkness, for the first time since the foal had arrived, she felt the shape of trust forming slowly, unspoken, but undeniable. It was more than a shelter now. It was a bond. The morning after the storm smelled like renewal. Wet cedar, damp earth, the clean scent of a world rinsed overnight. Sunlight broke through the clouds in long, gentle shafts. The tarp above Raven shivered lightly in the breeze, still holding its shape. Silvia sat on a flat rock near the shelter, sipping lukewarm coffee from a dented thermos. Her bones ached, but in a good way. Ash had curled up nearby, tucked into the grass like he belonged there. Raven's eyes blinked more frequently now, and she had managed to nudge the soaked feed with her lips, not quite eating, but curious again. The quiet was broken by the crunch of tires on gravel. Silvia stood, brushing her palms on her jeans and squinting toward the driveway. A faded red truck was idling just beyond the fence. She recognized it even before she saw the arm wave from the driver's side. Old Joe. He was one of the only neighbors within walking distance, his property tucked behind the ridge to the west. They hadn't shared much more than a few friendly waves and a borrowed ladder since she'd moved in. But that was typical in these parts. People kept to themselves unless something demanded otherwise. Joe stepped out of his truck, boots kicking dust. "Morning," he called, approaching slowly. "Didn't mean to interrupt anything." "No interruption," Silvia said. "Just a long couple of days." Joe nodded, glancing toward the direction of the trees, his voice lowered. "Saw you coming and going, hauling gear. Figured something was going on. You okay?" Silvia hesitated. She could have said yes. She could have kept the whole thing wrapped in silence like so many people out here preferred, but she didn't. "There's a mare, collapsed not far from the ridge, and a foal. He wandered up here a few days ago, probably looking for help. I've been trying to keep them alive." Joe's eyebrows lifted. "Mustangs." She nodded. "Huh." There was a pause. He scratched his chin and shifted his weight. "You call anyone?" "I did," she said, voice tightening. Drove into the BLM station, spoke to a ranger. He said it's policy to let nature take its course. Joe let out a breath through his nose. "Figures. Yeah." Another pause. Then he said, "Well, good on you for doing something anyway." Silvia shrugged. "Not sure good has anything to do with it. Just couldn't look away." Joe gave a half smile. "That's what makes it good." They stood like that for a moment, the breeze tugging softly at their sleeves. Then he reached into his back pocket and pulled out his phone. "Mind if I say something online? Nothing dramatic, just, I don't know, a heads up to the folks who follow the local trail cams and wildlife pages. People get pretty fired up about wild horses around here." Silvia's instinct was to say no. Her whole life leaned toward quiet, toward staying off the radar. She didn't want to be the center of a conversation. Certainly not one that could turn political or ugly or both. But something stopped her. Maybe it was the way Ash had leaned into her the night before, or how Raven had lifted her head for the first time in days. Maybe it was the way Joe wasn't pushing, just offering. She nodded slowly. Just keep it simple. Always do. He typed for a minute, squinting at his screen, then slid the phone back in his pocket. Posted something like, neighbors trying to save a wild mare in foal. Anyone know if BLM can step up, or are we still pretending it's not our problem? Silvia raised an eyebrow. Joe shrugged. Didn't name names. She let out a quiet laugh. Fair enough. By mid-afternoon, the ripple had begun. She didn't have social media herself. Never saw the need. But her phone buzzed with a text from a woman she vaguely remembered meeting at a seed swap last spring. Then another message, this one from Lily, forwarded from a mutual friend across the country who'd seen a post online. Is this your mom? Silvia didn't answer right away. She just stared at the screen, thumb hovering, unsure whether to feel exposed or affirmed. Maybe both. Later that evening, as she was checking on Raven's water pan, a truck rolled into her driveway. It wasn't Joe's. The logo on the door was familiar. BLM again, but the woman who stepped out was not the same ranger she'd seen days earlier. She was younger, mid-30s, maybe, with sun-bronzed skin and steady eyes beneath a ball cap. Her posture was confident, but not imposing. She carried a clipboard under one arm and a canteen in the other. Hi, she said as she approached. You must be Silvia. I'm Olivia, wildlife field officer. I saw the chatter online and followed up. Thought I'd come take a look for myself. Silvia folded her arms, not defensively, just waiting. I'm not here to shut you down, Olivia added, reading her silence correctly. Off the record, I wanted to see if the story was as true as it sounded. Silvia nodded once. It is. You mind if I take a look? Silvia led her through the brush, saying little as Olivia followed, stepping carefully around brambles. When they reached the grove, Olivia stopped and took in the scene. Raven lying beneath the tarp, Ash dozing beside her, and Silvia's makeshift tools scattered around like instruments of some quiet rebellion. Olivia knelt beside the mare, observing without touching. She's still breathing. That's more than most would be at this point. I've been giving her water, soaked feed, kept the flies off. You know what you're doing, Olivia said, more impressed than surprised. I'm just trying. They were quiet for a long moment. Then Olivia said, You weren't wrong to care. Silvia looked at her, startled by the gentleness in her voice. Thank you, she said quietly. I'll see what I can do, Olivia said, standing. I know a vet who owes me a favor, and there might be room at the Mustang Rehab Center 2 counties over. You'd help with that. I think someone already helped, Olivia said, looking at her. I'm just showing up late. The morning came with no fanfare, just light creeping in through the trees and the soft hum of the earth waking up again. But for Silvia, everything felt different. Raven had lifted her head at sunrise, not just shifted or blinked her side, but truly lifted it, neck trembling, eyes wide and alert. And Ash, dear, persistent Ash, had noticed first, nuzzling at her with an urgency that seemed to say, It's time now, Mama. Silvia had stood frozen for a second, her breath caught in her chest, afraid that even blinking might undo the miracle. Then she knelt beside them, tears welling uninvited in the corners of her eyes. Look at you, she whispered. You're still fighting. Raven turned her head slightly and let it rest on Ash's back, her breath shallow but steady. The foal practically vibrated with joy, moving in clumsy circles, ears flicking every which way. Later that morning, Olivia returned. She'd made good on her promise and brought with her a vet, a lean, soft-spoken man named Clay, with gentle hands and a slow draw that matched the pace of a land. He examined Raven without a single jarring movement, as if every motion was a silent prayer for grace. She's tough, he murmured, brushing a hand down Raven's side. Real tough. I've seen worse recover. Silvia stood nearby, arms crossed, holding her breath. Clay glanced at her, nodding once. You did good, he said. You gave her a chance. That's more than most would have. Silvia looked away, uncomfortable with praise. She did all the hard work. They administered fluids, cleaned the wound again properly, and left behind some supplement for strength. Olivia helped reinforce the shelter, added a better tarp, and laid down fresh straw that they'd packed in from the truck. The area no longer looked like a makeshift triage. It looked like care, like purpose. In the days that followed, Raven made slow but certain progress. She stood for the first time with Clay and Olivia at her sides, and Silvia watching with hands clenched tightly in front of her mouth. The mare had trembled like a newborn deer, her muscles spasming beneath her hide. But then she rose, shaky, narrow-legged but standing. Ash had bleated with delight and immediately tried to duck beneath her belly to nurse, which sent Olivia into half laughter, half tears. "I guess he knows what's good for him," she said, wiping her cheek with the back of her hand. Silvia hadn't said anything in that moment. She couldn't. Her throat felt wrapped in cotton, her heart tight in a way that didn't hurt. It just pulled with something too deep to name. Later that evening, she sat alone on the porch, the mug of tea in her hands gone cold. The stars had begun to come out in layers, one at a time, like a promise you didn't want to rush. The wind whispered through the tall grass. Inside the shed, Ash dozed. Raven rested in the straw beside him, finally breathing without that slight, pained hitch. Silvia stared into the darkness. She thought of all the years she'd chased structure, school schedules, work calendars, phone alarms, holiday planning. She'd built a good life, a stable life, full of boxes checked and responsibilities fulfilled. But nothing she'd ever done, no moment she could recall, felt quite as true as the last 7 days. She thought of Lily, how her voice sounded now on the phone, lighter, a little more distant. Maybe that was how it was meant to be between mothers and daughters. Maybe distance was what allowed them to grow into their own shapes. Silvia wasn't sure what shape she was becoming, but it felt like something worth keeping. The next morning, a plan was made. The Mustang Rehabilitation Center, 2 counties over, had a slot open. Olivia had made calls, pulled strings, and with Clay's agreement, arrangements were finalized for transport. They would leave the next morning. Silvia helped load the supplies into the trailer. Hey, medical kits, blankets. Ash had to be lifted gently into a separate padded enclosure, small enough to keep him stable, but close enough to smell his mother. The hardest part was watching Raven walk toward the ramp, slow, deliberate steps. Every muscle working harder than it should have, but walking, not stumbling, not collapsing. Walking. Silvia stood beside the trailer, her hand pressed against the metal, her palm flat, as if her steadiness might somehow transfer inside. Ash let out a high-pitched nicker, and Raven responded with a low, guttural sound that rumbled like a heartbeat. Olivia came to stand beside her. "They'll be all right," she said. "This isn't the end of the story. It's the next chapter." Silvia nodded, but her voice came only after a long pause. "I didn't expect it to feel like letting go." "It's not," Olivia said gently. "It's choosing to let them keep going." The engine rumbled to life. Silvia took one last look at the trailer, at the shape of the mare inside the shadows, moving just enough to remind her they were alive, still here, still hers in some small way. As the truck pulled away, she whispered, "Thank you for choosing my door." And for a long time after the dust settled, she stood in the quiet. The wind moved around her like a ribbon, and though the space beside her now felt emptier, she didn't feel alone. She felt honored. The day was warmer than Silvia expected for early fall. The wind barely more than a whisper through the cottonwoods, and a late afternoon light settled over the fields like a gentle hand. She turned off the dirt road, gravel crunching beneath her tires, and pulled into the lot beside the sanctuary's welcome sign. It was nothing flashy, just a hand-painted board fixed between 2 wooden posts, sun-faded but proud. Below it, a smaller sign read, "Mustang Rehabilitation Center. Visitors by appointment." Silvia stepped out of the truck slowly, her boots pressing into the soft earth with a kind of reverence. She carried nothing but a flask of water in one hand, and her breath held somewhere just below her ribs. She'd been invited, yes, but it had taken her weeks to come. Weeks to let the quiet of her property settle again. Weeks to walk past the empty shed without checking for movement. Weeks to let the part of her that had once fiercely guarded solitude now welcome the memory of interruption. The staff at the sanctuary greeted her with soft voices and kind nods. No fanfare, no speeches, just a simple, "You're Silvia, right? We're so glad you're here." They let her past open paddocks, past small groups of horses in various stages of healing. Some with halters, some without. All of them beautiful in that way only wild things are when they've begun to trust. And then she saw them. Raven stood near the fence, strong now, legs firm beneath her, coat glossy in the sunlight. She lifted her head as Silvia approached, ears pricking forward, and blinked slowly, the way she used onto the tarp. And Ash. The foal had grown taller, his coat darker now, but the energy in him hadn't changed. He galloped a wide arc, then doubled back to her tail, flicking his body, brimming with motion. He stopped just shy of the fence and snorted, ears forward, expectant. Silvia crouched and offered her hand. "Well now," she said softly, "look who's showing off." Ash nuzzled her fingers before turning and nudging Raven's side. Raven leaned slightly into him, solid, grounded, whole. It wasn't pride, Silvia felt. Not exactly. It was something older, deeper, like she was witnessing a story that had always meant to be told and had simply passed through her for a chapter or two. "You've both done better than I could have dreamed," she whispered. One of the caretakers, a woman named Danny, no older than Lily, came to stand beside her. She held a clipboard in one hand and smiled without interrupting the moment. "We've had inquiries about adoption," she said eventually. "But for now, they're here together. No rush." Silvia nodded, eyes still on the horses. "I didn't know I needed this," she said. "Not until they showed up at my gate." Danny hesitated, then offered, "We've been expanding our foster program. Some of the horses need a quiet place to recover before they're ready for adoption. Somewhere less structured. More like your place." Silvia turned to her. "You mean bring them out to me?" Danny nodded. "If you're open to it, you have the land and the heart. That much is obvious." Silvia looked back at Ash and Raven, then over the hills in the distance. The thought settled into her like water into soil. Soft, slow, but certain. "I need to build something better than a tarp and a tool shed," she said after a moment. Danny laughed. "We'd help." She smiled, then really smiled. "I'll think about it. But I already know." On the drive home, the sky had shifted from gold to rose, and Silvia rolled down her window to let the air move through the cab. She didn't play music, didn't need to. The rhythm of tires on dirt and the faint scent of sage in the wind was melody enough. When she turned on her road, the fence line came into view, empty, quiet, but full of memory. She parked the truck and walked the rest of the way to the gate, leaned her elbows on the top rail, and looked out across the tall grass. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the field, and then, just as she reached for the latch to go inside, she heard it. A soft, uncertain whinny. She turned. At the far edge of the property, just where the trees met the clearing, stood a single horse, thin and cautious, with a patch of white down its chest and eyes that blinked slow and unsure. Not a Mustang, maybe not even fully wild, but not someone's pet either. Lost, perhaps stray, looking. Silvia didn't move. The horse took a step closer, then stopped. She raised a hand, palm open, voice steady. "It's all right," she said. "Let's just see what your story is." And in that quiet, in that light, she didn't feel like the woman waiting at a fence anymore. She felt like the one who answered the knock, whatever shape it took. If this tale touched your heart, please take a moment to like, comment, and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories of hope, healing, and the incredible bonds between humans and animals. Share this story with someone who needs a reminder that even in isolation, there is always a chance for connection. And let us know in the comments, what lesson did you take away from Silvia and the Mustang's journey? Thank you for joining us today. And remember, sometimes all it takes is one knock at the door to change your world.